Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me this afternoon and evening, wherever you may be. My name is Justin Reash. I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society and the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University. And this is the latest installment of our Churchill Leadership interview series. Before I begin and introduce our guests, I wanted to remind you of two things. First, this panel is being recorded and will be free to watch on our YouTube page in the coming days. Second, we will be taking questions from the audience later on in our interview, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Tonight, this afternoon, wherever you are, I am honored, truly honored to be joined by Lord Boateng, who is the chair of the trustees of the Sir Winston Churchill Archive Trust. He served as Member of Parliament for Brent South from 1987 to 2005 and became the United Kingdom's first Black cabinet minister when he was appointed Chief Secretary to the Treasury in 2002. He then served as the High Commissioner to South Africa from 2005 to 2009 and was appointed to the House of Lords in 2010. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Paul.
My pleasure, Justin. Good to be with you.
Well, I really would like to begin our conversation with your background. I know that our attendees really appreciate learning the career and other aspects of our featured speakers. So allow me to begin with that you were born in London and grew up your formative years in Ghana, and then returned and studied law and became a solicitor before becoming an MP. May I first ask, what was your career like and your experience like as a solicitor, and what led you, what path did you take to becoming an MP?
Well, I mean, I was born, as you say, in London, but most of my childhood was spent in the Gold Coast. And then when the Gold Coast became independent in Ghana, where my father was a lawyer and my mother was a teacher, there was a coup d'etat, a military takeover. We had to flee. My father was flung into prison without trial. We had to flee to the UK with 2 suitcases. We ended up in what you would call a housing project in a place called Hemel Hempstead. It was a new town just outside London. And so for me, growing up, and then finding myself displaced, as it were, the priority was getting a job, getting a training that would enable you to succeed monetarily, that would enable you also to make a difference. Because the 60s, the mid-60s, 1966, was a very different time. You know, this is at the time of the height of the civil rights movement, the struggle against apartheid, the height of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. It was just before the events of 1968 and the flowering of that whole new 60s political dispensation. And so, you know, I was very much part of that growing up. And for me, the law was always a means of making a difference, of changing the conditions in which we found ourselves. And as a Black person, racism was there. As a person living on a housing project, you were aware of issues around housing, around social injustice and inequality. And I wanted to utilize the law as a means of addressing those issues. And it was therefore natural to become a lawyer. But although I've always been passionate about advocacy and oracy, there was no way at that time that I could follow my father's direction of travel, which was to become a barrister, a professional advocate, because in the UK we got a 2-tier system. Because at that time, barristers weren't allowed to work in law centers. and they weren't allowed to have direct access to the public. So I wanted to have direct access to the public. I wanted to be part of a movement that had its origins, interestingly enough, in the United States, in the Law Center movement. I mean, I read about that in my first term at university in the Yale Law Review. This is in what, 1970. And I said, well, that's what I want to be. That's what I want to do. I want to work on a legal center in the middle of a urban working class disadvantaged community. And so I became a solicitor, and that's what I did. And I worked for a firm of civil rights lawyers, solicitors, to do my training, having read law at university. Then I worked in the law center for what, 3.5, almost 4 years. And then I became a partner in that civil rights firm. And I never thought at that stage of going into politics. I was an activist, politically engaged, certainly. I joined a political party when I was 15 years of age. I grew up in a political family, but I didn't see politics as as where I wanted to be. I wanted to be a good lawyer, an activist lawyer. But from that, I got to a stage when I was acutely aware that I was constantly pleading cases for disadvantaged communities, but that those communities weren't, in my view, being well served by the existing political system. And also there was no one who looked like me in Parliament. There were no Black people in Parliament. There were no Black people in local government in representing my party or any party in any great numbers. There had been one member of the city council prior to my becoming a member of the city council in 1980, just one. And so I was the only one on the city council because he retired. And so I became part of a movement within the Labour Party to change that and to ensure that Black people and Asian people, people of color, were elected to Parliament. And so it's as an activist, then, therefore, that I became engaged as a lawyer rather than as a politician initially. And I was known as a lawyer on television, on the radio, in the media, long before I became a politician.
And do you think that your sense of, I shouldn't say sense, your mission for advocacy and activism and representation, how did that drive and that desire to be represented, as you said, when you became an MP, did you find yourself having the impact that you said you were somewhat missing, not missing, but what type of, did you feel that you had the impact as an MP to focus on those things as you did as a solicitor and barrister?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Justin, and a very good one, if I may say so. And I think the answer to it is this: being a lawyer and being a member of Parliament are two different things. They both require, obviously, a capacity to speak out, to communicate, to assimilate facts, to engage with challenging and complex issues. But they're two different roles and also different audiences. I had my first boss on the front bench when I became a front bench, a shadow minister, was an incredible man called John Smith. And he was very much an Atlanticist. He was someone who had a passion for social justice, and but he was a lawyer. And he encouraged me to go back into the law, and I became a barrister. For 2 years, I just wanted to focus on becoming a good parliamentarian. So I spent all my time sitting, listening, learning, doing the business as a new kid on the block. But he encouraged me to go back into the law because he said it was very important as a politician not to lose a sense of what was actually happening outside the political bubble. Do you follow me?
Mm-hmm.
And as a lawyer, you have you're working out there. You're not you're not totally absorbed as you can become in the political world, because you've got to address the realities on the ground for your clients. So he encouraged me to go back to the law, and I became a barrister, a professional advocate, concentrating on that, as well as my parliamentary duties. And he said, do that, but never forget, when you're addressing a political meeting or when you're addressing your colleagues in parliament, they're not a court of law. They're not the bench. They're not judges. They're not magistrates. They're a political audience. And likewise, when you're addressing a jury, when you're addressing a judge, don't think you're addressing a political meeting. You're not. So it's two very different styles of but the point is effective communication. As a lawyer, it's about acquittal. It's about winning the case for the plaintiff in the civil law, acquittal in the criminal law. In Parliament, in a political meeting, it's about trying to change people's position, not necessarily their vote, but their position. That's you want their votes if there's a chance, but otherwise you want them to get them to consider an issue differently, and you go about that in a quite different way. So it's a very important lesson I learned from a great man, John Smith, who sadly died before he could become prime minister. He would, in my view, have won the election in 1997, indeed, but he died tragically. And the history of our country and the Labour Party was all the poorer because of that, in my view.
So I would like to I want to first say thank you to everyone who is sending in questions in the chat. We will, of course, discuss leadership and oh, Paul, you're your camera.
That's right. That's the world of Zoom. Hey.
Yes, that's right. We'll, of course, get into Paul's role, new role as of 2020 as the chair of the Sir Winston Archive Trust. But I would like to pick up, this is a leadership conversation series. You noted John Smith, his role, his impact on you personally. If you could think of him or any other person that you worked with and encountered and were led by as an MP, who would those people be, and what are the qualities that you think shine through the years that retain their leadership qualities?
Well, that's interesting, Justin. I think, however, you have to go back before your boss is at work. You know, I think, frankly, yes, it begins in the home. I mean, if you look at Winston Churchill, what was the main influence actually on his life in terms of how he saw leadership? It was Randolph. It was his father and his mother. And I think for all of us, how we relate to the responsibilities that come with leadership in any form. I'm not just talking about political leadership. It can be academic leadership, professional leadership. It can be leadership in the armed services, of any sort, in the church, of any sort. What you learn about leadership is really very much based on what you learn from your parents.
Of course. And
how they operate as leaders themselves. And my father was a leader. He headed up his own set of legal chambers. He himself was a cabinet minister. My mother was a head of department and then head of a school. But they were heads of our family. And so you learn from them the art of listening. You learn from them empathy, which seems to me to be true critical parts of leadership. You learn from them too the requirement from time to have to make difficult decisions and to cut through all the stuff and get to the heart of the matter, and then to act. You learn that from your parents. You see it too at its best in those who teach you. And I can think of a number of teachers, one in particular, a man called David Little. Never forget him. You know, look, I was a black boy in a council estate on a housing project in 1966, going into a school for the first time. I was the only black boy in the school. And I'll never forget what David Little did. He took me into the classroom for the first time. And he said to these two boys who were there, Warby, Blake, this is Boateng. He's new here. I want you to look after him. Now, these two boys, Warby and Blake, they were bright, clever boys, but they were tough boys and naughty boys, seriously naughty. When we arrived on the scene, they were busy digging out a hole in the plaster in the classroom. But David Little still handed me over to them. Why? Because he knew that if he gave those two responsibility for me, and he knew those two respected him and feared him a bit, then nothing would happen to me. And that is a very important, if not the most important lesson of leadership. Know in any context who's going to make the difference, who's going to impact on outcomes. David Little knew that. So he was important to me. And then I think of my bosses in the law, my principals, Judith Walker, Tess Gill, two outstanding women lawyers of the 1970s, some of the first women lawyers to take the cause of battered women who were the subjects of domestic violence. They were incredible and able women, and they were my principals, working as partners for a great civil liberties lawyer called Benedict Bernberg, who's still alive. And then I think politically, three men, John Smith, now sadly dead, who I've talked about, a guy called Jack Cunningham, still very much with us, who was hugely helpful to me as a mentor when I first went into Parliament and was working on the Environment Committee. And then my head of department, when I became a junior minister in 1997, a guy now sadly dead called Frank Dobson. And Frank created a real spirit of teamwork in the department amongst the team of ministers. He had a bright, able team of ministers, all of whom actually, without exception, all of us in that first cohort of ministers in his department went on to become cabinet ministers. And he taught me the importance of teamwork at a political level. He taught me also the importance of respect for the civil service and every level of staff, whether it was the man at the door doing security or the principal civil servant in the department. Everybody was deserving of respect, and everybody should feel part and parcel of a team with a mission and a purpose. I learned that from Frank. He was a great man and a great leader.
I so appreciated your comment initially to my question regarding the family. You wrote, so for those who don't know, Lord Boateng wrote the foreword for the most recent issue of Finest Hour, which is the International Churchill Society's quarterly journal. I encourage you to become a member so you can have it if you're not already one. In your foreword, you say that you grew up in a household that discussed politics and religion around the dinner table. And it seems like to me from hearing your responses that having those conversations allowed you to think outside of the mind that you had currently challenge you, criticize, not criticize, but challenge your thinking. How important is it for leaders to challenge their current perceptions and current thinking as they lead, whether it be other cabinet ministers, as I lead a country or represent a country in your case as being the High Commissioner of South Africa? Challenging your current perceptions and current thoughts, I always think is incredibly impactful. Do you agree? And how do you feel about that?
I think it's very important, but it's important in a leadership role. It becomes particularly important in a leadership role because if you get it wrong and you don't constantly critique your positions on issues, and if you don't, if you're not prepared to change when the circumstances change, then the consequences for those who you lead are likely to be particularly dire. So it is important to create a working atmosphere in which people don't feel that their chances with you or their chances of promotion or their chance of advancement are going to be threatened if they don't throw out challenges, and if they don't simply follow what you say. But it does require a particular sort of leadership. You have to be pretty self-confident. Let's not kid ourselves. You have to have a pretty thick skin. You have to be able and willing to argue a point and not feel threatened by argument. And let's face it, very many leaders, and they can be very successful leaders. I mean, you can rise to the top and not be a person that encourages what I think is good, positive leadership, namely different ideas and challenges and all the rest. I mean, I know people who have risen to very high office and actively discourage that. Now, of course, the consequences have not been good, but that doesn't mean they've not risen to high office. But I think if you want positive outcomes, and if you want to be a happy and fulfilled person, then in your leadership role, which after all should also be part of your objective. I mean, you don't want to end up an unhappy, embittered person.
Yes.
Which some successful, quotes unquote, leaders do. Now, if you want to avoid that, then have around you people with different perspectives. Have around you people who enjoy a good discussion, who are passionate, who are prepared to challenge. But have around you also, and this is the challenge, people who will be loyal once a decision has been arrived at. I mean, I don't forgive disloyalty. I'm very happy for people to have different views. I don't forgive disloyalty. And I think it's important to be loyal when you are in government to those who are in leadership, even if you disagree with them. You need to be loyal.
If I may ask, Winston Churchill was known for, amongst many things in his political life, and I should say, I was on a Zoom call with your good friend Alan Packwood, our shared good friend Alan Packwood, on Friday, discussing with some GW graduate students, and Alan reminded the students of this, that one of Churchill's legacies is standing on principle, whether that be it worked out for him or it didn't work out for him, but stood on principle nonetheless. I mean, Alan reminded me of the quote of Churchill, and I'm paraphrasing here. It takes somebody to rat, but it takes someone especially unique to rat twice, discussing his leaving of the Conservative Party to the Liberals and then leaving the Liberals 20 years later, but doing so on principle. Is standing for principle part of effective leadership and positive leadership in your experience and in your mind? But I do want to, keep in mind your most recent comment of being loyal. Those seems like those two things could clash at some point.
Yes, they can clash. But of course, being loyal is about not dissing your leaders in public.
Yes.
Being loyal is about accepting collective responsibility. If you can't, you get out. You do the decent thing and you get out. What you don't do is to stay within the tent and undermine and backstab and badmouth. And that's important in my view. And it is important to have principles. It's important to have a bottom line and to know what your bottom line is. It's important, I think, to have a moral compass. Now, sometimes people say, well, to change your position is unprincipled. Actually, no, it's not necessarily unprincipled to change your position in relation to a particular issue or challenge. May or may not be unprincipled. It may be unprincipled, but it may also be you've changed because the circumstances and conditions have changed, in which case really you ought to.
Yes. Going back to I don't mean to interrupt you, but going back to challenging your current perceptions.
Exactly. It may also be that you have to say, well, what is of ultimate importance? I mean, let's talk briefly. I hope we're going to talk more this year about the Atlantic Charter.
Yes.
Now, the Atlantic Charter is an absolute classic in that regard. Winston Churchill knew that it was imperative to save the world, literally, against the evil of fascism, to arrive at an accommodation with FDR. FDR knew that he had to move his party and his nation to a position in which they were prepared to stand alongside the United Kingdom, its empire, against global fascism. So both men, in arriving at the Atlantic Charter and its content, made decisions that required them to move on different issues. And Churchill moved and FDR moved. And because they moved, the basis was set for ultimate victory. And because they both signed up to the Atlantic Charter, the movement of which my parents were part, of which Nelson Mandela was a part, was able to say in the 1940s and 50s, in the aftermath of the Atlantic Charter, Britain, you committed yourself to self-determination of peoples. You committed yourself, and it's at the heart of the concept of the United Nations, to non-territorial aggrandizement. All those things then became the basis of a freedom struggle. And that's why Nelson Mandela, in his autobiography, in Cry Freedom, makes special mention of the Atlantic Charter. That's why my parents, even though politically, my mother in particular, in terms of her growing up in the United Kingdom, my father grew up in West Africa, but my mother in particular would disagree profoundly with Churchill politically. My father was a dedicated fighter for colonial freedom, but they both saw in Churchill excellence in terms of the powers of communication, in terms of a commitment to parliamentary democracy, And they both saw the value of the Atlantic Charter to the freedom struggle. Do you follow me? So those,
Yes, of course.
so Churchill had his principles, but he knew also how to move forward. He had his moral compass, and it was that that drove him at all times. And well, the rest is history. We are where we are where we are.
I'm so glad you brought up the Atlantic Charter. Obviously, its 80th anniversary is this year. And you touched on this, and so if you can expand a little bit, the idea of self-determination, which was the founding, one of the of course the principles, but one of the most significant in its impact. What is its legacy today? Both if you may speak to it, if you feel, if we can.
No, I'm very happy to speak to it because I think it's highly relevant today. I don't think the world can look at what's happening to religious minorities in China and in Burma. And I don't think the world can look at what's happening to, let me give you a very pertinent and current example. The experience of Anglophone peoples in the Cameroon, which is a part of Africa that some of us on this line will know. Other of us on this line of conversation may or may not know of it, but it's a part of the world which only a few weeks ago, the Senate of the United States, in a bipartisan resolution, recognized the appalling horrors and injustices of a conflict there that has seen 1.5 million people put in a position of food insecurity, that has seen more than 400,000 internal refugees, displaced persons, more than 500,000 people having to flee the country in a conflict between an Anglophone minority and a Francophone majority and dominated government that the world's just not talking about. And yet those Anglophone people were forced into a federal situation in the aftermath of the last war, a federal situation that was subsequently backslided upon by the Francophone dominated central administration, with the result that an initial act of self-determination to create a dual lingual state is now being just simply cast aside with horrific consequences. The United States Senate has said something must be done. And hopefully, and we were on a Zoom call about this just the other day, some Francophone and German parliamentarians and civil society folk with ourselves in Britain, hopefully the world will now wake up to the horrors that are going on in the Cameroon, and that we'll see some concerted action. But I would argue that is based specifically on the Charter today and the action of the Senate, a bipartisan, unanimous action, which is rare, is it not?
Yes,
that I think ought to tell us something about the relevance of the Charter today.
Well, I hope to be able to have further conversations with you this year about it. I mean, the International Church Society is planning to mark the 80th anniversary later this year. So much more to come. I do want to get to your current role at the Archives Trust, and if I may read you. So actually, that's the second question. The first question I have for you. In my research, I've seen that promoting and working with youth has been a constant priority of yours throughout your career. How do you hope to connect today's youth with the work that the Archives does in your role?
You're right about the importance of intergenerational work. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
Because, we live in a world in which there is a real issue around communication across generations. There's a real issue, effective communication. And effective communication is about listening. It's not just about speaking. It's about.
You can say that again.
And my experience has been, as a lawyer, as a politician, that when it comes to policy in relation to young people, whether it is criminal justice policy or social service policy, actually adults who are responsible ultimately for formulating and implementing that policy find it very hard to listen to young people. They talk to them, they talk at them, they don't find it easy to listen. And as a result, the criminal justice system and the care system has consistently let down young people. And the danger is today, in terms of policy formation and implementation, that continues. I think we're a bit better. And some of the best things I think I ever did in government were as a health minister, as a home affairs minister, and then as chief secretary, with the responsibility for bringing together across government policy on children and young people in a document called Every Child Matters, that had the creation of a specific individual with responsibility for listening to children and then expressing their views to government. I think the notion of a children's ombudsman, of the notion of a children's commissioner who actually speaks to government, to power, having listened to children, that's important. When I was a social services minister with responsibility for the care system, I made sure that we had a young person who was in care supported so that they were more than just a token by an administrative team on the committee, so that we could actually hear from them about the day-to-day experience of children living in care. Now, that's also important when it comes to education. It's important when it comes to the curriculum. And I think if you listen to young people today, you will find that they don't actually experience in a school setting and aren't exposed in a school setting to a knowledge around the complexities that led to the Second World War. They don't and aren't exposed to a curriculum that embraces the importance of knowledge about empire and commonwealth. We found this in South Africa, amazing that the post-1994 generation in South Africa, the young people, they don't actually know about Nelson Mandela. So one of the challenges, they don't really understand who he was.
Wow.
So one of the challenges was how you ensure, in the context of teaching South African history in South Africa, that there's an understanding of who was Nelson Mandela, who was Kwame Nkrumah, who was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was Frederick Douglass. I mean, these were all part of the Pan-African movement. Similarly with Churchill. They don't see Churchill in the context of all that he was central to in terms of his times. So they may see a caricature of one sort or the other, but they don't get the complexity of the man. And the job of an archive is to be a place where there can be access to papers, to resources that reveal complexity, that don't gloss over complexity, and that don't discourage argument and disputation, but say that what's important is the evidence, and getting the evidence out there in an accessible form. So I'm very keen that we should work with Bloomsbury, with others, with the profession, with the teaching profession, not just at university level, but at secondary and primary level, so that we are part of that resource to give an understanding of global history, the history of these islands, the history of that has shaped us in the modern world. And an archive has to be about access. It has to be about evidence, and it has to be about enhancing access and making that evidence readily available.
You said upon your appointment, history is and will always be contested space. Mm-hmm. It has never been more important to ensure wide access to archival materials that give us insights into the lives of those who shape it, which is just a concise way of course, saying what you just did. And I have to say, that's an incredible statement. And it's an acknowledgement that history is, of course, a contested space. It is a evolving space, but it's an inclusive space for everyone to exist, to learn, to educate, to debate. And it seems like your role in the archive facilitates that experience.
Justin, that's my hope and expectation. And we need to reach out to the widest possible network of people to enable that to happen, because it requires will, it requires resource. I'm a former chief secretary of the Treasury. I'm always asking the question, where's the money going to come from? And how are we going to spend it most effectively? And what are our objectives in spending it? And how do we measure our success in meeting those objectives? I mean, you can take someone out of the Treasury, but you can't take the Treasury out of someone. So, that's where I'm coming from on that. So we do have a job of work to do as a trust to raise resource. We have partnerships to form with publishers, with educational institutions, with philanthropists, so that vision becomes possible, because access doesn't come cheap. It's all very well to say, oh yes, the archive should be accessible to primary schools. Yeah, but hold on a minute. If it's to be accessible to primary schools, it's got to be put in a form that is accessible to primary schools, and that doesn't just happen. It's got to be accessible because teachers have to have their capacity built so that they can make the most of it. Do you know what I mean? And all of that requires skills and requires capacity building, and that requires resource. But I'm excited by the prospects of that, and I've got a wonderful board who are equally excited. And as you know, because we talked about him earlier, in Alan we've got incredible professional archivists of global quality.
An international hero, I would call him, and I know if he's watching, he's blushing. So there's some incredible questions from the chat.
Good,
I would really love to get into them, but I want to reiterate one point you made. This isn't unique to Winston Churchill, of course, but the understanding of context, of complexity, that I think by going in the search of those, but I will say by searching for complexity and context allows history and archives and all these institutions to be inclusive. And I just think that you have to, anyone who is engaging with history or anything, the desire to understand context and complexity, it provides access, intellectually, and then of course becomes inclusive of all different ideas and points of view, which is of course absolutely needed. So allow me to ask a few questions. There was one. I'm going back up here. So This is from Fred Larson Dowuona, and I do want to say he made a comment earlier that he grew up in Gold Coast and then Ghana and was actually present when the coup took place. So he thanks you for your comments on that. So Fred says, goes back to leadership. Why do you think some leaders who rise to the top do not encourage others to also aim for the top?
I think, well, I can only share my experience. I think it's a great mistake to believe that all leaders are secure in themselves. In my experience, that is not necessarily the case. You can rise to the very highest levels and be deeply insecure. And because insecurity manifests itself in many different ways. And one of the ways in which insecure people operate is to cut down all around them anyone that might create any shade which might fall upon them, or anyone who might somehow rise above them. And of course, they might not actually want to rise above them. They might not rise above them. They might not actually present any real threat to their sunlight, access to sunlight at all. But if in the minds of the insecure they do, then they cut down. And
Yes.
I've seen it happen. We've all seen it happen in institutions in which we've worked. And that's why they don't seek to encourage the growth of other people. I mean, it's the old crab in the barrel phenomenon too. And that's very sad. And it's sad too, particularly when, if you, for whatever reason, are facing, have had to overcome disadvantage, if your response to that is not to encourage people who are facing similar adversity, and to take the view, for instance, well, if I did it, you can. There's nothing to stop.
Mm-hmm.
We've all heard those arguments, and that's very sad when that happens. But it does happen, and let's take one example. It's remarkable when you look at it that there were, with a great and remarkable, now I don't agree with her politics at all, but it was quite remarkable, the achievement of becoming Prime Minister on the part of Margaret Thatcher. A quite remarkable achievement. And she was a remarkable woman intellectually and in terms of her political leadership. But if you look at her cabinet, apart from Baroness Young, who was at one time leader of the House of Lords, there were no women heads of department at all, not one. So clearly she did not see it as part of her role as the first woman Prime Minister to bring up and to encourage the rise to cabinet level of other women. That's a fact. And that was distinctly not the case with Theresa May, for instance, who did support and encourage and build up other women. Now, there's not a time to go into why Margaret Thatcher didn't, but she didn't. She did not encourage and support the rise of women. So it's just one of those features that it is not every leader that seeks to bring up others or that has the self-confidence or the willingness to do so. But I think to go back to the point you made, I think it's also a generational thing, you know. Justin, I think your generation and the younger generation is actually much more inclusive in your approach, much more open to inclusion than mine, actually, and certainly than those before mine. I think 68. I'm the generation of 68, and I think we were more open to inclusion than those who came before us. But I mean, I think it's your generation and the generation of leadership today, political leadership today, is much more inclusive than their predecessors. Look, in the UK today, and it's not my party in government today, but the UK today has the most diverse government in our history, the most diverse in Europe. You know, 3 cabinet ministers who are people of color.
That's right.
Two great offices of state held by people of color. The ministerial ranks beneath, populated by large numbers of people of color. Now, in 1997, when I was elected, when the Labour government was elected in 1997, I was the only person of color in government. The only person. Never mind the first black cabinet minister. I was the first person of color ever to be a minister in 1997. So if you look at what's happened in the intervening years, we've made some progress, but that doesn't mean, and I must stress this, that doesn't mean that in society as a whole, we still do not face real issues around discrimination and disadvantage, both on grounds of race and gender, and indeed sexuality. But it would be wrong to say that we have not made progress. Progress has been made.
And we have, I'm conscious of the time, so I want to pick up on your last comment. You were the first Black government minister, the first Black cabinet minister, and the first Black ambassador from the United Kingdom. And you say as of 1997, you were the only person of color in the government.
Yeah.
But today, 2 of the 4 great heads of state have people of color. What do you think is the most significant impact of your experience, your personal experience of being the first person of color in those 3 roles? What do you think that most significant impact was?
Well, inevitably, the impact is to break a glass ceiling.
Yeah,
that's the impact. So it was no longer a matter of comment to see someone as a minister on television who was a person of color. So it no longer became an issue. And the issue of competence, of acceptability, that was no longer an issue.
Yes.
So that inevitably is, that comes with the territory. It also comes, Justin, now's not the time or the place to go into it. It also comes at a cost. You don't break through a glass ceiling without there being some scars. But there you are, and there's no point. What is.
Yes.
But it's not been. Politics is not a bed of roses.
Well, I will say, to your point about not having a comment anymore and it being noted, I did note that the first Black female ambassador in 2018, she said, and she was interviewed, and she said, "I hope this isn't a story in 10 years." And so I think that it's incredibly important to remember that there are barriers still being broken. So allow me to ask two really great questions. So this is from Ewan and Grant. Oh, excuse me, Ewan Grant in London. He wants to know, further to Lord Boateng's point about lack of historical knowledge in memory, does he see any signs of positive progress to reverse this trend, and to join up with use modern technologies to address the lack of historical knowledge in memory in current generations?
I see potential. The question is, are we going to realize it? I do think there's a very important conversation that's beginning to take place around curriculum content. I think digitalization is hugely important. And we have opportunities to digitalize archival material. We have opportunities to create a greater freedom of access. And in another part of my life, I'm on the board of a museum, the Museum of London. It's one of our great civic museums.
It's an incredible museum.
And terrible though the lockdown has been, actually, we have put a real focus on the digital experience, which means that going forward, we will get very many more visitors, quotes unquotes, to the museum. And you know, let me give you an example. If you take the Fire of London, the Fire of London is particularly susceptible to effective digital representation. I mean, you can create a really exciting digital experience that's able to appeal to different generations and different levels of knowledge. And I think we can do the same with the history curriculum. But it goes back to the point you were making, Justin, about inclusivity in that. You want to tell many different stories. You know what? You want to tell many different stories in your presentation of history. And let me give you an example. Let's take Churchill in the Sudan. There is a very interesting story about the Mahdi.
Yes.
Which you can approach through Churchill. And you can approach it through Churchill's changing perception of the Mahdi. It's very, very interesting. You cannot understand the nature of Islamic fundamentalism, for instance, unless you have a better understanding of Islamic history. You know, and we have to have a better understanding of global history. The number of people, I'm appalled. I mean, there's a very important current debate about Iran. Now, you know, there are many people out there who believe that Iranians are Arabs. They are not. Do you know what I mean? I'm sorry. You know, Iranians come from an ancient civilization, which is quite distinct from the Arab civilization, that is quite distinct from our own civilization, and arguably older than all of us.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So
of course,
we have to, and I think one of the mistakes we made, and now's not the time to go into it either at this day, but I think we should do, and there's a wonderful picture of Churchill with Gertrude Bell and
yes,
Lawrence in front of the pyramids. Now, if we had read Bell and if we had read Lawrence and understood the history of the Middle East, also the consequences, frankly, of our own interference in the Middle East. But if we'd read Bell and Lawrence in particular, I don't think we would have made some of the mistakes that we did make. And I own up to being part of those mistakes in relation to Iraq. We did not fully understand the Sunni Shia dimension. we did not fully really understand the roots of Arab nationalism. And that's why history is just so important in all its complexity.
Of course, and Lord Boateng, I want to thank you for this incredible conversation. We are out of time. There are many questions that we weren't able to get to. I apologize for not doing so. And you know, I greatly appreciated all the back and forth we had about understanding, and I mean, this is just reiterating, understanding complexity, understanding context, putting history into context, whether that be years, decades, centuries. So I wanted to thank you for sharing your time with us and your incredible thoughts.
It's been my pleasure, Justin, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. And next time, let's just have a question and answer.
I agree.
From your audience, because I've really enjoyed this, and I would have liked it to have gone on. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And for those who, if you are not yet a member, like I said at the beginning, simply please go to www.winstonchurchill.org. You cannot buy that domain name these days. It's very simple. We'd love to have you as members. Lord Boateng, very good evening, and thank you all for joining with us.
It's a pleasure. Good evening to you all. Cheerio.
Take care.